Welcome, everybody, to another episode. Today, I'm absolutely delighted for our guest who, it's fascinating, every once in a while, I get an opportunity to talk to somebody that I've literally been following, who's been doing stuff long before I ever even got into medicine. So it's amazing to have pioneers. And, the roads that these pioneers travel are so difficult. Their stories are so inspiring. And this show is all about hope. Hope is the most important concept when you talk about self principles, sleep, exercise, love, and food. A lot of times we're talking about food, but we forget people want hope. And with hope, they're able to make better choices and they're able to do stuff. So the goal here is to bring on people who inspire us, whose journeys are amazing, who are trailblazers in their own right. So I'm delighted today to present Brenda Davis. Brenda, I am so excited just to have the opportunity, the privilege to have you on the show today.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hashmi. It's really a privilege to be with you, and thank you for your kind words.
Oh, absolutely. I'm a kidney specialist, and one of the hardest things that I see in kidney disease is the majority of patients that I take care of are due to causes that are entirely preventable by lifestyle. And the majority of that lifestyle component is diet. And I know before the show started, you and I were talking about some of your struggles. I'm going through a similar journey in terms of trying to convince even our dietitians that a whole foods plant-based diet is ideal for kidney patients. But let me ask you, tell us a little bit about your journey. What was it like when you were first starting out? What inspired you? How did you overcome some of your obstacles?
Well, I started in the late 80s. And to be really honest, I started in the late 70s, moving towards a more plant-based diet. It was back even in high school, I would say in the mid 70s. I was interested, but I had never really met a real live vegetarian except for one in my life, and that was my grade 8 science teacher. And he was a hippie with long hair, and that was the only vegetarian I'd ever met. But I was so pulled in the direction of eating plants. I was convinced because of all of the wonderful components in plants that are so health promoting. I was convinced, I don't know if you recall, I'm just going to pull this out. I don't know if you recall, 1990, there was the World Health Organization actually wrote this paper called Diet, Nutrition, and the Prevention of Chronic Diseases. And in that paper, and it was a little book, really, they basically came out and said that we need to determine the strength of the link between diet and disease. And they ended up saying that the link is so strong that governments need to make nutrition a national priority. And they went on to say that governments also need to be very careful because the industries that are producing foods that promote these diseases have a lot of say in national nutrition policy, and they warned governments against allowing that because it would come at the cost of the health of their populations. And so I thought it was just fascinating, and I read that document from cover to cover several times. It was so inspiring to me that they took the stand they did, and they identified 2 categories of foods as being largely responsible for the epidemic of chronic disease that we were starting to see back then. And the 2 categories of foods were processed foods, especially highly processed foods, and animal products. And they pointed out that a number of foods were protective, and those were legumes and vegetables and fruits and whole grains and nuts and seeds and all of these wonderful plant foods. And that had a great impact on me. And then I must admit that for me, the biggest factor here I was actually a public health nutritionist. I was teaching. Almost all of my nutritional education materials were based on Canada's Food Guide. And at that time, Canada's Food Guide had 4 groups, 2 of which were animal products. We had the meat group and we had the dairy group. And I have to tell you, today, Canada's Food Guide is very different. So our food guide is a plate with 3 sections. The big half the plate is fruits and vegetables. A quarter of the plate is grains with a big emphasis on whole grains. And then a quarter of the plate is protein foods, which includes meat and dairy products, but it emphasizes plant protein first. So plant protein is listed first in all of the guidelines, and they tell people that they should be emphasizing plant choices over animal protein choices. And so that's legumes and like lentils and beans and split peas and nuts and seeds, and all of those things are included in that group. And then there's a glass of water beside the plate, and they encourage water to be the main beverage that people consume. There is no longer a dairy group. There's no exclusive meat group. So we've come a long way. But I can tell you, back in those days when I was a public health nutritionist and I decided I wanted to go plant-based, for me, it was an ethical choice. I wanted to contribute as little to pain, suffering, and death as I could possibly do in my lifetime. And so I just felt really strongly that I didn't want to contribute to a system, a food system that caused so much suffering. And so I decided that I needed to be eating more plant foods. And I can remember at the time saying to my husband, we had 2 young children. This is, 30 plus years ago. And I said to him, would you be willing to become a vegetarian? And really, I was saying a vegan, but we barely even knew that word back then. And he looked at me and he smiled and he said, I thought you'd never ask. He said, I'd love to be a vegetarian because the biggest, most important thing for me is to leave a softer footprint on the planet. He said, I can't think of a better way of doing that than to become a vegetarian. And so off we went. And our parents were just terrified we were going to stunt our children or, in those days. And here I was, a public health nutritionist. I really didn't know if I could stay in that profession because everything was based on these food groups, which included all of these animal products. And I thought, how can I stay and what will my peers think of me? And will I be ousted from my profession? I always wanted to be viewed as being a reliable source of information. I was often interviewed by Peter Zosky on CBC. I was respected by my peers, and I was so afraid that I would lose that respect going in this direction. And so I had that internal struggle, like, what do I do? And then I remember the lecture I gave to myself. I basically said, if you don't stay and try to change the system from within, who will? You've got to have the courage to stand up for what you believe in. And so I made the decision to stay, but I also made the decision to be very evidence-based in everything I said and to be providing my peers with the information that they would need to help people who had made the same decision about their food choices as I did. And so to my great relief, my peers didn't oust me. And in fact, they started inviting me to speak on this topic at their national nutrition conferences. And within a few years, I wrote my first book, which I wrote with Vasanto Molina and Victoria Harrison. And it was a guidebook it was called Becoming Vegetarian, but it was really a vegan book in disguise. We had a whole chapter called Without Dairy, and the dairy industry in Canada took us to task and wrote a 45-page rebuttal to our book and took a full page ad in our professional journal to try to discredit our work. And so it was, a little bit of a battle in that regard, but our peers actually stood by us more than we ever imagined they would. And I can remember being at the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. Back then it was the American Dietetic Association, but in a room speaking to, 900, there was room for 900 people, but having 300 people sitting on the floor listening to this lecture because they wanted the information. And at Dietitians of Canada and international dietetic conferences. And so I feel so fortunate that it all worked in the end, but it wasn't without its, we definitely had those who were not very keen on what we were saying, as you can imagine.
What's fascinating about your journey is if it wasn't for people like yourself, we wouldn't have been able to make the necessary steps now. When I got into the field, and part of my role that I have as my day job is I work for a large organization where we oversee about 4.5 million people. And my job is to create the clinical nutrition programs. And even there, the challenges that I faced was there were sort of things that were decided on. This is how we've always done it, right? So dairy was a staple as part of our plates. And, one of the first things that we focused on was stealing your ideas. we adopted what we call the healthy plate model, which is exactly your model. And that's exactly how we frame it. And then trying to convince people to move away. And some of the criticisms that we would get, and this is, about 8, 9, 10 years ago, was, well, everything is based on population studies. But what's fascinating in the nutrition field now is we have randomized control studies that have come out that say exactly the same thing, but not only do they say the same thing, they're even more convincing. We have head-to-head trials against the ketogenic diet, against the Mediterranean diet, to be able to show what makes this powerful. People like yourself, people like Neil Barnard who are putting the research out, it's fascinating. So let me ask you, because I know you've written a number of books, and I'm really curious about your latest book, Nourish. Tell me a little bit what inspired you to write it, and what's really the message in that book?
Well, Nourish was a book that came about because of a need I felt. I met, it was funny, I was speaking at the Planetary Project conference, and in the airplane on the way over, a lady sat beside me, and her name was Dr. Reshma Shah, and she was a pediatrician, and we just started talking, and we became friends at the conference. We kept in touch. She did a lecture at her hospital, and I gave her some tips, and she said, I want to do more. I need to do more in this community. And I said, well, what we really need is we need a book for families and children. I said, we have general guidebooks like Becoming Vegan, for example, but we don't have anything specific for families that really dives deeply into the guidelines that are needed for children at various stages. And she said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll do that if you'll do it with me. And so that project began, and this is the result. It's Nourish, and Nourish. Our goal here was really to. I'm going to read you what David Katz. You know who David Katz is, of course. Wrote the foreword. And this is what he says in his foreword at the end. He said, in the end, what sets Nourish apart is not that it is expert. It is. Not that it is insightful. It is. Not that it is wise, compassionate, or evidence-based. It is all of that. What sets Nourish apart is that it is all about food for love. Embrace this book, and it literally embraces you back. Is it a book or a hug? Maybe both. Lean in and let this beautiful book nourish your understanding, your motivation, and your willpower and skill power alike. Lean in and taste the love. And so what we were really trying to provide families with, we were trying to provide families with a really comprehensive guidebook that touched on all of the issues that parents might have. The book is actually divided into 4 parts. So we have the consideration at the beginning where we talk about why people are shifting towards plant-based diets. And it's about health. It's about what we call home, and which is our planet, the environment. And it's about heart and about the consequences our food choices have for animals. And then the second part is about care, and it's about making sure we are careful in meeting all of our nutritional requirements. And so we go through all the macronutrients, the micronutrients, how to put together a healthy diet, and then pregnancy and lactation and all the stages of childhood. And then we have a section called confidence, which really are about principles of feeding, family meals, the dinner table and what happens around the dinner table, and all the issues around underweight and overweight and raising a family in this kind of a world. And then the last part is all about connection. And so, shopping and planning and menus and recipes and all of that. So it's the 4 parts: consideration, care, confidence, and connection. And so that's, kind of summarizes this new book. And we tried to really make it not just for plant exclusive eaters, but even for plant curious eaters or people that are just, in the process of making that shift, and how to do so effectively and safely. So that's what that's all about.
So let me ask you a question that's probably on a lot of people's minds. A lot of parents will say they have really finicky eaters. What are some things that you would say to the audience out there to help them to start having their kids start making better choices?
Well, it depends a lot on when you are making the shift to plant-based. So if you've got a child who's been raised on a standard American diet and they're 10 or 11 or 12 years old, that's a very different challenge than if you're raising a plant-based child from the get-go. So if you're raising a child from birth on a plant predominant or plant exclusive diet, it's much easier because I can remember when my children were little, there wasn't a choice between white bread and brown bread or white rice and brown rice. All they ever saw was whole grains and legumes and fruits and vegetables. And I can remember when my son was 3 years old, he said to me, "Mommy, we were driving in the car and we drove by McDonald's. I'd really like to have a McDonald's hamburger." So I thought at that point I needed to tell him that we don't what those burgers really were. And I said, honey, we don't eat McDonald's hamburgers, even though I knew he had seen the commercials of the hamburglers stealing hamburgers off the trees. So I decided to tell him that, those hamburgers are made of cows, and ours are made of beans and nuts and those kinds of things. And he looked at me and he said, "Mommy, people do not eat cows." Like it was the stupidest thing he'd ever heard in his life. It was just absurd to him. And then when I told him that they do, he said, "But Mommy, them have eyes. Don't they know that cows are people too?" It was he just so got it. And I think, when you think about little children, they tend to be compassionate, they tend to be open. I can remember, the foods that we would provide, I would involve them. And I think that's so important for parents to bring your children to the market. Let them pick some of the food. Grow a little garden. If you don't have a yard, you only have a balcony, grow some pots. Teach children where foods come from and maybe grow some sprouts, grow a few herbs, whatever you can do. But involve them, get them in the kitchen, chopping, cutting, pouring, whatever is age appropriate for them. Involve them in food preparation and be excited yourself about delicious fruits and vegetables. When you get excited, they'll get excited too. And I can remember my son when he was 2 years old and I took out a head of broccoli. I think broccoli was one of his favorite foods, but I turned around to prepare something and my broccoli had disappeared and I couldn't find it anyway. I went back to the fridge and finally I found him hiding behind a couch, eating the entire head of broccoli. And, they loved all vegetables. I remember being in an Asian restaurant and my kids were eating this stir fry and they were just so excited. They were so excited by the food they were having. And there was a lady next to me and her kids were eating grilled cheese sandwiches and French fries. And she said to me, "How do you get your kids to eat those kinds of foods?" And I thought, well, I guess just introducing them to these foods. They never had grilled cheese sandwiches or French fries. That wasn't even food to them, I think. And so, but it's hard when you have raised your children on a standard American diet and they're 10 or 11 or 9 or whatever it is. And all of a sudden you're asking them to eat differently. What we have to remember is, I think it's important to be really compassionate, to listen to what they say, and to hear them and to involve them in the transition, to let them know why you're wanting to make the transition and ask them, how can we make this easier for you? Are you willing? I can remember when we first made the transition, my daughter was 4 years old and she wanted to continue to eat salmon sandwiches. So I kept buying some little tins of salmon. And in about a year, she decided she didn't want that anymore because she could feel the hook in her mouth. She said, "I could just feel that hook in my mouth. I didn't want to herd fish anymore." And so she came to that herself. And I think that's important too. And so if your children are quite ready to go all the way, that's okay. See what kind of compromise you can come to. And maybe you can do some of these veggie burgers and veggie hot dogs or whatever it is to make the transition easier for them. And you don't have to be perfect. And where vegetables, if they're not used to having vegetables, again, get them to help prepare them and teach them about those vegetables and why they're so wonderful and then get them to prepare. Maybe it takes preparing them in the oven with a little bit of extra seasoning or whatever that will make them crispy or whatever it is. Just be flexible and be kind, be loving, and don't think you have to do it all overnight. You don't. And if your children still want to eat meat, for example, I know Dr. Shaw, my writing partner. When she and her daughter went plant-based, her son and her husband were not ready to go there. And they agreed to eat plant-based in the house, but whenever they went out to the restaurant, well, they were ordering their meat. And it took a while for them to decide they didn't want to do that anymore. And so every family's different, and you just need to be patient, loving. And I think the other thing is to really go the extra distance to make the food wonderful, make it flavorful, honor different cultures at different nights. And I think sometimes you can do a Mexican night or a Japanese night or Ethiopian night and teach the children about those cultures and about the foods that are traditionally consumed within those cultures and make it fun that way and get them to even do some of the research about what people in different countries are eating. And there are lots of ways of engaging children where food is concerned. And I think, really one of the greatest gifts you can give your children as a parent is, the healthy eating habits that will last them a lifetime and will protect them against disease and will make them enjoy a more optimal health, but also will open their palates to a variety of options. And also the ability to prepare food healthfully and happily is a great gift, because I know so many children grow up not barely knowing how to boil water. And I think that's really sad. So as a parent, we want our children to have those skills. Those are essential life skills, in my view.
I love your message, and it's such an important one that I actually want to highlight some of these things. What you're saying is so powerful. Involve them, listen, explain the why, respect different cultures. For the longest time, I used to talk about how food is medicine, but I also talk about how food is culture. And finding ways to respect people where they're at makes such a huge difference. And for people watching, I think one thing that we always forget is, especially for children, they look for heroes. And it's our job to serve in those roles, which means we have to model the behavior, how we care for others, how we eat, how we respect the environment. All of those things they're going to watch, they're going to model, and they're going to build those behaviors off. And that's going to be a lifetime of learning that we're teaching them without even knowing. So just because we say it is not the same thing as we do it.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think generally in life, our example is probably the most powerful tool we have to impact change in others. And we are our children's greatest teacher. Our example is just so powerful. Our example in physical activity, in how we eat, how we sleep, in our joyfulness, in all of those things. And it's really important.
So, switching topics a little bit, one of the things that I don't think gets talked about enough. So part of what I do is I'm a kidney specialist. The other part is I'm a bariatrician. And part of that role involves seeing people for bariatric surgery. What fascinates me in both of those fields, and what saddens me, is this concept of food addiction. You started the conversation talking a little bit about processed foods. And we know that the best way for foods to have an addictive personality are the ones that are highly processed, which means the sugar content, the fat content, the faster it gets absorbed in the brain, the faster it lights up the brain, the same places where drugs do. But one of the things we don't talk about is how difficult it is to change. I've had patients where we've had to, this is graphic, but we've had to amputate their arms. They've gone blind, but they can't give up their fast food. They know the consequences. And, the definition of addiction is continuing to do the same thing despite knowing the consequences. Mm-hmm. And it's a topic that, as we talk about all of these important ideas, it doesn't get addressed. It's not a DSM-5 or DSM-4 diagnosis. So it's not something that's out there, but food addiction is real, and I see it every day. So my question for you, given your vast amount of experiences, for people who really say, look, I get it. I understand that sodas are not good for me. I understand that all of these French fries and, the hamburgers and the pizzas are not good, but I can't stop. What are some things people can start that can help them on this?
It's interesting when you think about foods in nature. The fat and sugar and salt is so dilute in those foods. And when we extract them and concentrate them, it really messes up our appetite control. And we can't stop eating them because we're drawn to foods with those components in them. So when we concentrate those components, it really messes with our minds. And so it's not an easy thing to overcome any addiction, and food is not much different. But I think the most powerful tool that I've seen, are you familiar with True North Health Center? They do something that really helps to retrain the taste buds, and that is fasting people. So they will put people on a water fast for, sometimes 2 or 3 weeks, and then they will reintroduce foods. And I can tell you those foods taste much different to the person after fasting, and their whole bodies are able to readjust. This isn't something you do on your own, but I think I'm giving a plug for True North because I am so impressed with sort of their fees and their structures. How they do this is really commendable because it's so affordable. It's ridiculously affordable. You get the medical care. They have, medical doctors there who are very skilled. And so for people that have extreme challenge, I think something like that is, I would consider. And then for other people that may be able to manage more on their own, it's one step at a time. Think about people back when they were all switching from whole milk to skim milk, and you would go from whole to 2%. And then if you went back to whole, it would taste like cream. And then from 2 to 1, and then from 1 to skim, and how your taste buds kind of readjust to the lower fat levels in these foods or in the fluid milk. It's the same for other things. And so what I would suggest is step 1, getting rid of the absolute worst culprits. So, stop eating deep fried foods, stop drinking soda. But you need replacements. And so for a lot of people, so one of the things I would say, if you're addicted to sodas, for example, you could start by diluting with soda water and eventually getting to the point where your soda is mainly soda water with a few slices of fruit to flavor it. Or even, you fill an ice cube tray with pure blueberry juice or pure grape juice or pure pomegranate juice, and you drop an ice cube in your soda water to flavor it. A juice cube. You can do something like that to still have that fizzy drink that satisfies that need, but you slowly make it less and less sweet. And then when you go back to tasting a full sweet soda, it's disgusting. You just can't believe you would have ever wanted to drink something that sickeningly sweet. And so it's the same with your fried foods. You might start by using an air fryer, for example, to produce some crispy, foods that fulfill that need. And then gradually you can shift to more wet cooking methods. But so I think it's all step by step. And one of the things that I think is important too is not, working at the issue by adding healthy foods as opposed to just removing foods, and making the healthy foods crowd out the unhealthy foods. And so, start by aiming to add 4 or 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day and gradually build up to that 10 or 12 serving goal that you might have, and figure out, unique ways for you to add those foods in. And so, and make a goal of having at least 1 serving of legumes a day, beans or lentils, and that will crowd out foods. And so slowly, you're just filling your world with healthier foods in your body. It's so interesting how your body gets used to these flavors, and those concentrated sweet foods or concentrated fatty foods actually taste disgusting once you've trained your palate to enjoy whole plant foods. The flavors of whole plant foods are amazing. The textures are amazing. And your body feels so much better that it starts to crave these things. I know when I go away from home, the thing I crave the most is greens. I can never get enough greens, it seems. And for me, a meal isn't a meal without some greens. So your body really does adjust. And so, but you do need to give yourself time and be compassionate with yourself during that transition phase.
The concept that you're describing, we call it habit stacking. And so it's this concept of you've built up all of these bad habits, and it may be, you're addicted to French fries or you're addicted to soda. And what you're describing is adding on a little bit of something that's healthier. Little by little, you start to reduce the bad, you start to increase the good, and you're building these habits. And as you build those habits are sustainable. Willpower, on the other hand, we know what happens on January 1st every single year. People get all excited, they're going to change, and it never lasts because they never try to build those habits. So I love this concept. For air fryers, I'll tell you, I had Chef AJ on and we were talking about this. I love my air fryer. One of the things I really like is I take sweet potatoes, I cut them up and I put them in the air fryer because I love that little bit of crunchy texture that comes out. And I found it's delicious, but I'm not a chef. I have no idea how to cook, but it's these little tricks that make me feel like I'm still having my pleasure foods.
Yes. And it's so interesting because a lot of people say it's crazy that many doctors call plant-based diets extreme when, going on medication that could have harmful side effects for the rest of your life, or having your chest cracked open is somehow not extreme. But the way that I look at it is that going on medications, well, popping a pill doesn't seem so hard. Getting your chest cracked open, well, it ends. So then you can continue on with your life. But when you're asking someone to change their food is our connection to people. It's how we express our love for our families. It's our social life. It's our joy in life. And so for a lot of people, it is scary. It is extreme for them to have to make those kinds of changes. And so we need to approach that with such compassion. And we need to provide support systems that will provide a tribe for them, a group that will be going through this with them. We need to provide amazing food, because I think one of the biggest things that I recognize is that, when you go plant-based and you've slowly built this plant-based cuisine for yourself, you don't enjoy your food any less than you did when you were eating burgers and fries. In fact, you may even enjoy it more because your body enjoys it so much. And this is what we need to help people to understand. It is no sacrifice at all. Once you've been introduced, people just want to feel satisfied. They want to eat delicious food. And they want it to be enough. When you think about a person who's eating a standard American diet and you just say to them, well, you need to go plant-based. Well, what do they picture? They picture the tomato and lettuce on their burger and the rest of the burger's gone. That's their idea of what, plants are. They are not used to having a filling meal that's plant-based. And so that gradual introduction to the most amazing foods. I can remember one time, I have to tell this story because my husband called me and said, could I invite some out-of-town guests for dinner? They were at his workplace, and I said, well, sure, no problem. So they came over and I made a really nice meal. And the next day at work, some of my husband's colleagues were teasing them, saying, so you guys had vegetarian last night, kind of thing. And they looked at each other and they said, well, no, we didn't. We did not. What are you talking about? We had the most amazing meal. We had lasagna. We had these stuffed bread things with all of these amazing stuffings. We had this unbelievable cream soup. Well, they didn't know it was cashew cream. They didn't know the lasagna was completely vegan. They had no idea about any of that. And then they started to think, and they looked and they said, did we have any meat? And then they said, I guess we didn't have any meat. But it never dawned on them that there was no meat in the meal because they had so much fabulous food. They were so satisfied and they enjoyed it so much. It didn't even dawn on them. And that's our goal. We want people to to love the food, enjoy the food, and enjoy preparing the food, enjoy buying the food or growing the food. So all of those things, but that doesn't happen overnight. And so we need to be patient and we need to be kind with people making this transition.
I love that. Now, switching topics, I'm really curious. You had a project on diabetes in the Marshall Islands. Tell us a little bit about what that project was all about.
Well, for those of you that aren't familiar with the Marshall Islands, I actually just did a lecture not too long ago. I think it was in January. John McDougall has a Mastermind Climate Change Summit. And that you could look up that. It's free on YouTube. But if you type in climate change, Brenda Davis, Marshall Islands, or something, that will come up. And I explain what we did there. But the Marshall Islands are extremely remote. So they're about 2,300 miles southwest of Hawaii and about 3,500 miles directly north of New Zealand. They're just above the equator, about 5 to 7 degrees above the equator, but it's about 1,200 islands over a lot of distance. The islands are tiny, and most of them they have many atolls. And these atolls are really just coral reefs. And so the main island that houses about half the population, which is about 30,000 people, it's not huge, but it's 30 miles long and 3.7 miles in area. So it's this long, skinny strip of land. They have the highest rates, or among the highest rates of diabetes on the planet. And over half the surgeries on the island are amputations due to diabetes. So diabetes is rampant there. And one of the things that's really interesting is that, 80 or 100 years ago, there was virtually no diabetes at all because these people lived off the land. So they were essentially consuming plants that grew on the islands, plants that grew in the ocean, and fish. That was the very bulk of their diet. And their carbohydrate was breadfruit. They had some pandanus as vitamin A source, some taro. They had lots of coconut, a lot of coconut in their diet and all the various parts of the coconut. And that was their diet. And then they went from that to having so many people on an island that they couldn't produce enough food for themselves. So they would have to import food, but they didn't have a lot of industry. So people were very poor and they would import the cheapest processed foods they could get. So it was white sticky rice, ramen noodles, spam, and this their main beverage is luau. And luau is just high fructose corn syrup and food color, essentially. And so it's white rice with some fatty meat, often processed meat, and luau. And that you can't design a diet to induce diabetes any more efficiently than the diet they adopted. The children, I was so stunned that the favorite snack of the children was raw ramen noodles with Kool-Aid powder sprinkled on top, if you can imagine. And sometimes they would put a little white stuff on top of that, which was something called Ajinomoto, which is pure MSG. So just shocking, just shocking. And so we, there was a group of Seventh-day Adventists called Canvasback Missions that had been traveling to provide medical teams, so oncology teams, ENT teams, all sorts of teams to the Marshall Islands and Micronesia generally, to help the people, to provide free surgeries and medical care for the people. And they'd been doing this for probably 25 years. They essentially watched the diabetes epidemic unfold, and they said, we've got to try to do something to help these people. And if you know about Seventh-day Adventists, a lot of Seventh-day Adventists are vegetarian or very plant-based in their orientation, and they have been real pioneers since the 40s or 50s in plant-based nutrition as well, with Loma Linda University and all of their research. And so they decided to put in for a grant from the U.S. Department of Defense to do some sort of work to help the Marshallese people. And they were awarded a grant to do research. And so they partnered with Dr. John Kelly from Loma Linda University. And I have written a book, and I'll just show you. It was called Defeating Diabetes. And it's this book right here. And the medical director of the program had just purchased the book. And he said, I think we need to use this book for our program for these people. And so they called me and said, would you be willing to literally design the program in terms of what we would be doing with the participants and the nutrition, set it all up, set up a kitchen, train cooks, do all the PowerPoint presentations and plan the activities with the participants and so on. And I literally put my life on hold. I had to cancel all sorts of things and put my life on hold. And I went over for 8 months. My husband and son came over for about 5 months. My daughter was already in university. This was back in 2006. And we did a randomized control trial where we had everybody that came into the program was either randomized to the intervention group or a control group. And the people that were put in the control group were devastated. They wanted to be part of the intervention. And so we allowed them after the fact to go through the intervention so they could experience it as well. So it was a fascinating project because we were given the TB and leprosy clinic to take over. And it was so rat and cockroach infested. The stainless steel medical cabinets had 2 inches of rat droppings on all the shelves. And we literally had to rebuild it and to create a diabetes wellness facility. And then we put 5 cohorts through the program. And so the program was intense. So for 4 days a week, they would be with us for 8 hours a day, literally going through the training to learn about food and nutrition, to learn to cook healthy foods and to do exercise and to learn, how to grow foods. All of these things were part of the program. And so we did that. And then after our money ran out, because the government funding ran out, we just continued to go back. And every couple of years, we would do more interventions we did interventions for the Nidajela, which is the politicians. We did them for the police department. We did them for the teachers. And then the last time I was there, which was actually in 2017, I created a nutrition education curriculum for the schools. And so just continuing to go back, and I was so touched. I just received an email from one of our people that still is on ground in Majuro at the Wellness Center. And he said that somebody from the president's office had just come to him and asked for my mailing address because the president was so excited about the presentation I did for the climate change conference. He was showing it all over and he wanted to send me a letter of thanks for doing that presentation. So I feel like I'm still there. I love the Marshallese people. I guess one of the stories, to give you a flavor of what it's like. Every time you're there and you leave the island, they throw you a yukway party and they bring you things that they've made out of the seashells and the pandanus leaves, and they sing to you songs to show their love and appreciation. And I can remember a doctor who came to help out at the program. He was walking home on one of the side streets, and he was from New York, and he saw a big gang of teenage young men, I guess teenage boys, I would say. And he said this fear just went through his heart. It was 11 o'clock at night, and there's this gang of boys coming down the street, of teenage boys. And he said he was so scared because he would have been terrified if he were in that situation in New York. And he said, as the boys got closer, they had their arms around one another and they were singing. And he said they were so friendly and loving to him. They just, hey, where are you from? And welcome to Majuro. And he said, I knew instantly I was in a very different place. These people have the most amazing laugh. They're the happiest people. I think it's the happiest people I've ever been with in my life. Just joy-filled. And the little kids, They play baseball making cardboard gloves and a bat out of a piece of wood, and they're just laughing and joyful all the time, and they have almost nothing. And so I felt very privileged to be there and to work there. And we did see people reverse their diabetes, and we saw average drops of blood sugar of about 75 milligrams per deciliter in the first 2 weeks. We saw drops of A1C in the first, 3 months the first 3 months of about 2 points. So we saw some really wonderful changes in the people. And what I was really stunned, it just shocked me, is some people that had health issues for 20 years, they were gone in a week or two. I can remember a lady saying to me, my joints have been sore for 20 years. I could hardly lift my arms up. I could hardly walk. And she said, I just can't believe that eating these foods in a week or 2 weeks, my pain is gone. I can't believe my pain is gone. I can walk again. And so many people told me their brain fog was gone, that their heads were fuzzy for years, and it just disappeared because their blood sugars were normalizing. And we saw, and of course, constipation. Well, we had people that hadn't had a bowel movement in a week and a half. They would go a week or 10 days without a bowel movement. And all of a sudden, they went from eating 5 grams of fiber a day to eating 50 or 60 or 70. And I'll tell you, they were having bowel movements every day. And for some of them, it was scary. They didn't know that was normal. But it just incredible changes in how they felt and how they were able to manage their diabetes, or in some cases, overcome their diabetes.
Wow, such an amazing, inspiring story.
Oh, thank you. And I have to tell you that the story is actually this is one of my latest books called Kick Diabetes Essentials, and it provides people with sort of a step-by-step guide to how you do this. And then we have a whole cookbook that goes along with Kick Diabetes Essentials. Both books have recipes, but this one is more completely recipes. And so I really tried some of the favorite recipes that I've done myself are in these books, and many of the recipes we even adapted from what we used in the Marshall Islands.
So Brenda, how can people learn more about you? I know you have a website.
Yes, BrendaDavisRD.com.
Perfect. And how about any other places to look your stuff up? I'll have the links for Amazon.com so people can check out your books.
Yeah, and then we actually have a website for Nourish as well, nourishthebook.com. And then Reshma and I are Reshma's very active on Instagram. I'm just a beginner and I'm just learning, but we do these Instagram lives every so often. You can find out at Dr. Reshma Shah. And then I'm on Facebook and very happy to connect with people that way as well.
Fantastic. I was really looking forward to this interview because I knew it was going to be inspirational. It was going to create hope, and everything about you just resonates with people. It just has this thing where people get excited. They have hope. So I'm so delighted. And I think the work you're doing is just phenomenal. I want to thank you for coming on the show with us. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hashmi. It's been my privilege and my honor. And I just want to, just remind people that, changing your lifestyle is really the most powerful thing that you can do to change the course of not just your life. Sometimes I think it's so encouraging to know that when we make choices that are truly good for ourselves, the benefits extend far beyond ourselves. And so there's no diet that you can consume that is better for this planet. No diet that will produce a softer carbon footprint than a plant-based diet. There's no diet that's kinder for animals. The benefits just extend far beyond ourselves, and we need to remember that as well.
What a great way to close. Always thinking about others and making this little small journey of life that we have on this planet to make the planet a little bit better. Thank you, Brenda Davis, for everything you do.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hashmi. Thank you for having me.